I think we're recording. I think we're on. Well, hello, gathering class. It's great to be with you again. It's been a year since we last hung out when I got to teach in your class. It's incredible that a year's already passed. Um, it feels like A, it's been no time at all, and B, it's been 10 years. And I'm sure you can be with me in that one because this COVID mess has just got us all um, upside down with the calendar and all of that. Anyways, it is great to be with you. Pastor Ryan Goble here. I am the associate pastor of the venue, which is one of our areas of worship on Sunday. So we have the worship center, the chapel, and then the venue. And so I'm under Rustin Rosello, and we get the pastor over there each and every Sunday and then during the week. It is great to be with you again this summer. Thank you for inviting us back. Thank you, Bill and the rest of the leadership team. Thank you for allowing us to, Bob and I, to come and teach again. We had the best time last year, being able to just teach through Genesis 1 to 15, creation to covenant. And we are so excited to be taking a lot more material, Genesis 16 to 50, and yet showing how it's still one story. How the Bible's one story, how Genesis is one story of God's redemptive plan for humanity. We'll find a bunch of characters as we go, a whole host of characters and supporting cast, and yet the whole thing is about God. Everything in Genesis is about Yahweh. Everything in the Bible is about God and his redemptive plan for humanity. So with that, I'm going to share my screen. And I think that should work. I think Bob did that last time and it worked out pretty well, but this will allow us to see my PowerPoint. Okay, I think we're good. Yes, we are. Okay, so God's promise, Genesis 16 to 15 to 50. That's what we're doing this summer. We're doing Genesis 16 through 50. It's a lot of material, and yet we can go about it a bit quicker than we did last year because it's much more narrative driven than it was in the first 11 chapters or even chapters 12 through 15. And so we'll be able to fly a bit quicker through all of this. As we go, a little bit about me and Bob. So we both went to Trinity Evangelical Divinity School. I got my MDiv, and Bob got his MATS, and he's currently studying for his bioethics major. One day, I hope to get my doctorate either there or at Dallas or somewhere else. But until then, I am just excited to be able to teach the Word at Scottsdale Bible Church. So as we go, I should probably also share this. I am married. I've been married for almost 5 years now to my beautiful wife, Jessica. And we have two furry animals who we think of as family named Dash and Winston. Both of them are long-haired miniature dachshunds, if that matters to you. But they are awesome. For those of you who have been praying with us for the past year through our process of desiring a child, God has heard our prayers, but has not answered our prayers yet. And so we are still waiting to hear from the Lord. We're still waiting for a child, but that's going to be right up the alley today, Genesis 16 and 17. And so we are desiring to be faithful in this process. So thank you for your prayers. Keep praying. We're praying that God will bring us a little one sometime in the future. So as we go, our 12-week theme, Bob shared this last week. It's God's promise. This 12-week theme through Genesis 16 to 50 is all about God's promise, and specifically faith through families, and how God is going to hone in on one family, one man in that family, Abraham, or as he is known now, Abram, before his name changed. And it is through Abram that God is going to rescue the world. That's the line that Jesus comes from. It's the line that King David comes from, the line of royalty, and all of Israel is from. And now as Gentiles, we are grafted into the family of God, but we also all have one heritage, which is through Abraham. And so we're going to see how this one man's faithfulness throughout the years, and his faithlessness even, culminate into God's promises. And we're also going to see how nothing can stop God. Nothing can stop him from accomplishing his purposes. Humans are going to get in the way constantly throughout this whole process, and we'll see that today. Um, but God's promise is to continue the line of faith through families in order to rescue the world. And so the emphasis that Genesis has is that God is the creator of all that is. His creation of human beings is in his image. The nature and consequences of human disobedience. That's what Genesis wants us to see as well. The beginning of the divine covenants. We're going to cover another one today. And then God's choice of a people through whom he will bless the nations. And again, we'll see that today. And so putting it all together, again, Bob said this last week, it's really important that we know the big overview of Genesis and where we've come so far. It's that Yahweh continues to prove himself faithful, and humanity continues to prove that it's deeply broken and needs saving. And so we have Yahweh's faithfulness and humanity's sinful nature coming into clash a lot of the time. And yet what we see is that in spite of humanity's deeply broken nature, Yahweh will come and he will be faithful and love his people and take care of them for all eternity. And then lastly, I think this is the biggest theme in Genesis, which is Yahweh's glory seen in his faithfulness. It's not about the faithfulness of Abraham. It's not about the faithfulness of Isaac and Jacob. It's about Yahweh's faithfulness. Despite all the wickedness of humanity, Yahweh still pursued a people. Yahweh chooses based on his sovereign choice. It wasn't like Abraham earned it. It's just that God decided. Yahweh never let sin get in his way. And we'll see that again today. And Yahweh is the true faithful one, which shows his glory. It's interesting that it's in our sin that God is able to once again show himself faithful. And then lastly, Yahweh has had a plan from the very beginning to save his people. And so that's kind of where we are. We're at creation through covenant. Yahweh has initiated so many things for his people. He is the one who is writing this story. He is the one who is propelling Genesis forward, but also just all of history forward. He is initiating. Even when people are sinful, even when we are failing, Yahweh is the one who comes to his people and rescues them. And so I really hope you can see that theme as we get going. So lastly, God's faithfulness now will be delivered through the Abrahamic family. And so what we'd like to think, or some of us are tempted to think, is that the faithfulness is of the people, and it's actually God's faithfulness that we see. And it's his faithfulness through these families, and they can then have faith because of God's faithfulness, that we are able to have redemption through Christ Jesus. And so we're going to see these families over the next 12 weeks sin and fall. They're going to triumph in faith. They're going to need God desperately. He's going to come through for them, and everything in between. We're going to see all these stories, but it's one family under the tutelage, the headship, the sovereignty of Yahweh. And so that brings us to today. Abram, not Adam. I'm used to Genesis 1 apparently. Abram, Sarai, and Hagar. Genesis 16 through 17. Before we jump in there, I got to do just one quick recap, real quick, just to show us where we are coming from, what the context is for our passage today. And so this was from Bob's presentation last week. It said, "Now the Lord said to Abram, go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you, and I will make of you a great nation. And I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." So we see in Genesis 12, when Yahweh comes to Abram, he makes this fantastic promise that Abram is a man that doesn't have children. He is old at this point, and he's probably in his 70s, maybe 60s when he moves. and there's no way he has any hope for having kids. And yet Yahweh comes and says that he's going to bless them. And then right before our passage today is Genesis 15:17 through 21. This is the last passage that we have before we get chapter 16. And it says that this is where the covenant with Abraham is made. This is where Yahweh comes to Abraham in the smoking pot and goes in between the animals and makes the covenant with him. He says, when the sun had gone down and it was dark, behold, a smoking fire pot and a flaming torch passed between these pieces, the pieces of animal, during this covenant ratification. And on that day, the Lord made a covenant with Abram, saying, to your offspring I give this land, from the river of Egypt to the great river, the river Euphrates, the land of the Kenites and the Kenizzites and the Kadamites and the Hittites and the Perizzites, the Raphaim, the Amorites and the Canaanites, the Girgashites and the Jebusites. I give you all this land to you and your offspring. By the way, quick hint, when reading through the Old Testament, if you don't know how to pronounce a name, just say it quickly and with confidence and people will believe you every time. So all that said, what we have here is Yahweh's promise to Abraham. That's the backdrop to our text today, is that Yahweh has promised to give Abram an offspring, to give him children, not just his extended family like Lot, but an actual son, an actual child from Sarai, his wife. And so that's what we're waiting for in Genesis chapter 16. When we get to Genesis 16, we are waiting for this child because God has promised Abram for 3 chapters now that he will give him a child. Now we get to chapter 16, and this is 10 years after receiving the promise from God that they would have a kid. 10 years later, it says, now Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children, none yet. 10 years in their most senior of years. He's 86 at this point. I mean, I can't even imagine waiting 10 years after God gave you a promise for children, let alone in your late years. And his wife is not getting younger either. And we know how biology works, and hope is dwindling and has dwindled, and it needs a miracle. And so Sarai is feeling deeply shamed about this. And it says that she, Sarai, had a female Egyptian servant whose name was Hagar. And Sarai said to Abraham, behold, now the Lord has prevented me from bearing children. Go into my servant. It may be that I shall obtain children by her. And Abram listened to the voice of Sarai. So after Abram had lived 10 years in the land of Canaan, Sarai, Abram's wife, took Hagar, the Egyptian, her servant, and gave her to Abram, her husband, as a wife. All right, let's break this down together. What we see here is Sarai doubting. It's been 10 years, right? They're waiting for Yahweh to move on his plan. And we see Sarai doubting Yahweh. And she says, I need to provide a child for Abram before he dies. He's getting older. He's 86. Like, I need to provide this. And the only way she found in her own mind was to do what they would do a lot in the ancient Near East, which is provide a concubine or provide another wife for their husband to produce offspring. This was widely accepted in the ancient Near East, but it doesn't really say in the text that God disapproved of this, and yet we can see all over that this was not God's plan. We'll find that later. This is not what God wanted. God did not want Abram to have another wife. He did not want Abram to go elsewhere to find God's promise or to make it happen himself. He wanted Abram and Sarai to understand that this was their promise. It was their promise. When God made the promise 10 years prior, and even before then, that Abram would have children, Sarai was his wife at that time. She was his only wife. And so because of that, God made the promise not just to Abram, but also to Sarah, that she would be the one that bears children. And so here we see Sarai is deeply questioning her calling, deeply questioning God's promises. And so what does she do? Like a good human, she decides to fix it, right? Instead of waiting on the Lord, instead of waiting on what God would have, she decides that she's going to take matters into her own hands and produce a child for Abram through her maidservant, Hagar. And so this is despair. This is despair in despite of God's promise. Which this is our first really, or not our first, but our first for this season, for this summer. This is our first look at the faithlessness of God's people and how they're not these heroes of old, but they're deeply flawed individuals like you and I, and how they have deep doubts and they desire the same things that we do, and yet they also go about it the same way we do, which is to go around God. Now, what's interesting here is I have three words that are highlighted and underlined: listened, took, and gave. What's fascinating about this passage is that it harkens directly back to Genesis chapter 3 in the garden. This is exactly playing out just like the garden did when Eve went and saw the fruit. So let's look at that passage together. Genesis 3, 6, 17, and 19. It says, so when the woman, Eve, saw that the tree was good for food, that it was a delight to the eyes, and that the tree was to be desired to make one wise, here it is, she took of the fruit and ate. And she also gave some to her husband who was with her, and he ate. And then later on, as God's pronouncing judgment upon Adam, he says, and to Adam he said, because you have listened to the voice of your wife and have eaten of the tree of which I commanded you, you shall not eat of it. Cursed is the ground because of you. And then skipping down, it says, till you return to the ground, for out of it you were taken, for you are dust, and to dust you shall return. So it's the same pattern. Eve saw the tree, she took from the tree, and she gave from the tree. And Adam listened. He was passive. He didn't stand up, right? God gave the promise directly to Adam, that the charge to not eat of the tree directly to Adam. Eve was deceived. She forgot God's promise, and the serpent was able to lead her astray, and she chose to take. She decided to take and give it to her husband Adam. Well, just like her great grandmother, or however far back that goes, Sarai finds herself in a similar situation where God has delivered his promise directly to her husband, not to her. She wasn't present for that. And instead of going to her husband and seeking counsel and telling him about her despair and being reminded by Abram about the promise of God, we have Sarai doubting God's promise, doubting his faithfulness, thinking that she had to do something that was outside of what God had intended for her. And so she goes and she takes and she gives to Abram. And this is sin. This is supposed to model sin for us, that we forget God's promises first. Then when we forget God's promises, we go and we take what we see as beautiful, what we see as our desire, right? Eve desired to become wise, to become like God. And so she took the fruit. Sarai desires to have a child. And so she went and took a young, fruitful woman and gave her to her husband. And both of these scenarios show the selfishness and the arrogance, the blindness of humanity. And we're no different than Sarai. We're no different than Abram. And what we see here is that Abram listens to his wife. Instead of saying, no, how could you say this? God promised us a child, and he promised it to you and to me, Sarah. Not to someone else, but to you and to me, God will give a child. And yet that's exactly what he does, the exact opposite. He doesn't stand up for God and what God had promised and said and spoken. Instead, he gives in, he's passive, he listens, and he takes for himself Hagar as a wife. And so we have this juxtaposition between Abram and Adam. Abram's going to be the father of all nations, right? The father of many nations, the new nations, right? God's people will come from Abram. just as all people came from Adam. And Sarai will be the mother of God's people, just as Eve is the mother of all people. And so we have these two, just like Adam and Eve, standing again at God's doorway of promise, and they doubt him and they fall. Well, it doesn't go well. And we know that they should have done this because the plan backfires immediately. It says, when Abram, went into Hagar and she conceived. And when she saw that she had conceived, when Hagar saw that she had conceived, Hagar looked with contempt on her mistress Sarai. And Sarai said to Abram, may the wrong done to me be on you. I gave my servant to your embrace. And when she saw that she had conceived, she looked on me with contempt. May the Lord judge between you and me. But Abram said to Sarai, behold, your servant is in your power. Do to her as you please. Then Sarai dealt harshly with her, and Hagar fled from her. Immediately, this plan falls apart, just like in the garden, it immediately fell apart. Hagar has contempt for Sarai. She's not grateful. She doesn't want to give her child as Sarai's child. She has contempt for her, and Sarai is completely shamed, and she is caught off guard and is embarrassed. And in her shame, she tries to cover up, just like Eve did, just like Adam did. So she blames both God and Abram. Sound familiar? That's exactly what Eve did. She blamed Adam, and she also blamed God in this situation. And she says, may the Lord judge between you and me what happened. And yet they're both at fault. It's not like it's just Sarai's fault or just Abram's fault. It's both of them. Both of them were faithless. Both of them failed to do their job. And what happens is calamity. And Sarah deals harshly with Hagar, so much so that she has to flee. Sarah is losing her humanity, it seems, that she has forgotten that she is to be a child, a daughter of God, to walk blamelessly before God. And so this faithlessness is seen. And so we're sitting here waiting for God to show up and be faithful. God, where is this child? God, what are you doing here? Now there is a child, but is it the right child? How do we understand Ishmael in all of this? How do we understand this son of Hagar? What do we do with this? How do we understand this? We know that Sarai and Abram have sinned, but now what? Does this ruin the promise? Does this ruin God's plan? And the answer, of course, is no. God's plans are never ruined. They can't be thwarted by humanity. God can use humanity's brokenness to his advantage, but God is never thwarted by us. And so what happens is Hagar is left. She flees from Abram and Sarai, and a beautiful moment happens. It says, the angel of the Lord found her by a spring of water in the wilderness, the spring on the way to Shur. And he said, Hagar, servant of Sarai, where have you come from and where are you going? She said, I am fleeing from my mistress Sarai. The angel of the Lord said to her, return to your mistress and submit to her. The angel of the Lord also said to her, I will surely multiply your offspring so that they cannot be numbered for multitude. This is beautiful. In spite of the faithlessness and destruction that Sarai and Abram bring upon this poor woman, and despite the fact that they go against God's wishes and they try and take it into their own hands, God still provides for Hagar. She's the forgotten one in all of this. She's the one that's treated harshly. She's the one that is cast out. And yet God says, I'm not going to forget you. I will bless you. This is not the right son. This is not the son of promise, but I am going to make my own promise to you and to your offspring. This will not be the line of Abraham. This will not be the line that Jesus comes from, but it will be a mighty line, and God he will bless it. And so what we have here, the angel of the Lord said to her, behold, you are pregnant and shall bear a son. You shall call his name Ishmael, because the Lord has listened to your affliction. He shall be a wild donkey of a man, his hand against everyone and everyone's hand against him, and he shall dwell over against all his kinsmen. The angel of the Lord tells her that her son is going to be this wild donkey of a man. I love that it says that he's just going to be this strutting guy. This guy's going to go around. He owns what he walks on. No one pushes him around, and he's going to be fruitful in all of this. And Ishmael actually means God who hears. And that's what is happening here. Hagar has cried out to the Lord, and I'm sorry, Ishmael is God who sees, God of seeing, which is why she calls the name of the Lord who spoke to her, "You are a God of seeing, Ishmael. Truly, I have seen him who looks after me." Therefore, the well was called Vir Lahai Roy. It lies between Kadesh and Bered. And Hagar bore Abram a son. And Abram called the name of his son, whom Hagar bore, Ishmael. Abram was 86 years old when Hagar bore Ishmael to Abram. So this is this whole saga of sin and redemption, that God won't let the marginalized go unseen. He won't let those who have no power in this moment go unseen. He will be a voice for the voiceless. We see that in Hagar. And he brings Hagar back to Abram and Sarai. And she's with them the rest of her life with Ishmael. And we see that Abram is 86 years old. So 10 years prior, actually 10 years prior, he moved to Canaan. 10 years prior, he had received a promise. And now he has a son, but it's not the right son. And God has made that very clear. And will continue to make that very clear as we go into chapter 17. And so we have Abram now at 86 years old, still waiting for the son of promise. When will the son come? Where is the son? Where is who we'll know as Isaac? Because clearly it's not Ishmael. So chapter 17 comes pretty quickly on that, and yet 13 years pass. In between chapters 16 and 17, we see 13 years go by, and Abram is now 99 years old. He was 86 when Ishmael was conceived and was born, and now he's 99 years old. And I can only imagine what it's like to wait for now 23 years for a promise to come true. For a moment, I just want to talk with you. Let me get back here. Okay, there we go. My wife and I have been struggling through infertility for 2 years, and it's been the greatest season of trial in our life. And then you add on top of it COVID and all of the other stresses that have been going on with COVID, with quarantine, and now with the social unrest that we're seeing in the world. We have been going through it, and we're waiting and waiting and waiting for a child. And we believe God has a child for us. We really do. I believe that God, I wouldn't say promised us a child, but we firmly believe that God has placed that in our heart for a reason, to have a child. And so we're waiting, and we're trying to figure this out, and we're trying to be faithful. And I'm doing everything I can to make sure that we're not taking things into our own hands and be like Abram and Sarai, that instead we are faithful and wait on the Lord. That's difficult, and it's been a really difficult season for us. Now, I can only imagine, it's been 2 years for us, and I'm 30 and she's 26. I can only imagine what it's like to get a promise at 76 years old, wait 10 years, have a son who's not the right one, and then wait 13 more years. 13 more years. It's been 23 years of waiting. God, where are you? God, when are you going to produce? God, when are you going to give us what you promised? This isn't just a desire like my heart is. My heart's a desire. I haven't received a direct word from the Lord, and yet I am longing for a child desperately. I can only imagine what it would be like to be promised a child by God, a miracle baby at that, and not see it for 23 years. I don't know about you, but I would lose hope, most likely. I'm not any better than Abram. I'm not better than Sarai. I would be in despair. And I can only imagine how you'd feel. We're all human. We would feel this despair. So as we read this, let's not think that we're better than Abram and Sarai, or look down our noses at them, but instead let's look and say, that would be me. 23 years of waiting and relying and resting in God is so difficult when God is silent. Um, and I know that we all have desert seasons. We all have silent seasons from God. Um, so what we need to remember is that in spite of despair, in spite of not knowing what's going to happen, we need to hold on to God's real promises to us, that He will always, in the end, win. He will always bring us to Him in the end, and that we have an eternal hope in Him. So before we move into chapter 17, I just want to say that if you're going through a prolonged season of waiting, or you haven't seen God move in the way that you expected Him to, wait, be patient. God is moving. He does not count time like we do. He doesn't. He's not patient like we need to be patient, because He is in all time and He's also in no time. And so 1,000 years is like a year to Him, or like a day to Him, and a day is like 1,000 years, it says. So we have to trust that God has our best in mind. Okay, I think that's enough of my soapbox. Email me, though, if you have any questions about that, or thoughts, or anything you want to talk about. Email me about what God's doing in your life right now. I'd love to be encouraged, or I'd love to encourage you in this season. So with that, let's get back to the presentation. So PowerPoint. Okay. So 99 years old, Abram is. It's been 23 years. And it says, the Lord appeared to Abram and said to him, I am God Almighty. Walk before me and be blameless, that I may make my covenant between me and you and multiply you greatly. Then Abram fell on his face, and God said to him, behold, my covenant is with you, and you shall be the father of a multitude of nations. No longer shall your name be called Abram, but your name shall be called Abraham, Abraham. For I have made you the father of a multitude of nations. This is an amazing passage. And we're going to just continue in just a minute to see the rest of the covenant laid out before us. But 23 years have gone by, and the Lord appears to Abram and reiterates His promise that He already made to him 23 years prior. But he's going to go deeper. He's renaming Abraham. He's preparing him for his son. He's saying, no longer are you just Avram, which just means Av is father in Hebrew, Av. And so Avram is father. It's no longer that you're just Av, you're going to be Abraham, which is father of multitudes, father of many. This must have been the greatest day of Abraham's life, to be given another promise, a reconfirming promise from God that what He said is true, and that He will take care of Abram and Sarai, that He will give them the desires of their heart that He promised years prior. And yet what we see is God says, I am God Almighty, walk before me and be blameless. That's what He desires, is for Abraham to be blameless before Him. And Abraham has already failed at that and will continue to fail at that. And yet God will continue to uphold his end of the covenant, because God is faithful even when we're not faithful. And God is faithful when we're faithful. The common denominator there, though, is that God is always faithful. And so what does He say to Abraham? He says, I will make you exceedingly fruitful, and I will make you into nations, and kings shall come from you. And I will establish my covenant between me and you. And here it is, and your offspring after you throughout their generations, for an everlasting covenant, to be God to you and to your offspring after you. And I will give to you and to your offspring after you the land of your sojournings, all the land of Canaan, for an everlasting possession, and I will be their God. This is the moment. This is it. God's about to establish the covenant of circumcision in just a moment. And he's saying here, this is my promise to you, Abraham. I will be your God forever. You will be my people forever. I'll make you exceedingly fruitful. Kings shall come from you. The King of Kings will even come from Abraham, Jesus. And this covenant is not just for Abraham and Sarah, but it's for all of their children, and children's children, to every generation, and now to us as Gentiles, even grafted into their family. This promise still is true today. And so Yahweh continues. And God said to Abraham, as for you, Abraham, you shall keep my covenant, and you and your offspring after you throughout their generations. And the covenant, this is my covenant, which you shall keep between me and you and your offspring after you. The covenant is twofold. He already said, walk before me and be blameless. And now he says there's a sign. There's every male among you shall be circumcised. You shall be circumcised in the flesh of your foreskins, and it shall be a sign of the covenant between me and you. He who is 8 days old among you shall be circumcised. By the way, that's why Jesus was presented at the temple when he was 8 days old, was to be circumcised and blessed. It says, every male throughout your generations, whether born in your house or bought with your money from any foreigner who is not of your offspring, both he who is born in your house and he who is bought with your money shall surely be circumcised. So shall my covenant be in your flesh, an everlasting covenant. Any uncircumcised male who is not circumcised in the flesh of his foreskin shall be cut off from his people. He has broken my covenant. And what we see is something fascinating happen here. It's not just a promise to Abraham and his biological children. It is a promise to all of the people of Abraham, all of the sons and daughters and people of Abraham, both those who were born through Abraham's line and those who were brought in from Abraham's line, which in the very beginning in Genesis, we see the future hope for the Gentiles, for us, that we would be able to be brought into the family of God and to the promises of God. God is from the very beginning laying out his promises for the church, laying out his promises for us today to be part of the family of Abraham, that we would be his people. And the sign is circumcision, that they would cut off the foreskin from all of their members. And this was, as I'm sure you know, a very painful ceremony to go through as an older man. Abram was 99 years old when this happened. And yet now they all wear with them in their most secret of places, their most treasured of places. These men carry with them the promises of God so that they would remember all their days who Yahweh is and that they are his people. But God said to Abraham, as for Sarai, your wife, you shall not call her name Sarai, but Sarah shall be her name. I will bless her, and moreover, I will give you a son by her. I will bless her, and she shall become nations. Kings of peoples shall come from her. Then Abram fell on his face and laughed and said to himself, shall a child be born to a man who is 100 years old? Shall Sarah, who is 90 years old, bear a child? And Abram said to God, oh, that Ishmael might live before you. And God said, no, but Sarah, your wife, shall bear you a son, and you shall call his name Isaac, Yitzchak. I will establish my covenant with him as an everlasting covenant for his offspring after him. As for Ishmael, I have heard you. Behold, I have blessed him and will make him fruitful and multiply him greatly. He shall father 12 princes, and I will make him into a great nation. But I will establish my covenant with Isaac, whom Sarah shall bear to you this time next year. And the word Isaac means one who laughs. And so we see that God is forever putting before Abraham and Sarah their doubt. God is forever putting before them all of their issues that they have and saying, Abram, in your physical body, you will carry the reminder of your doubt that you went into Hagar. It is on the same member that you went into Hagar that this covenant is made. And now, as you go to conceive with Sarah, you will remember the covenant God made with you and the promise. That is as intimate as it gets. That God is reminding Abraham all the time, every day, of both his doubt, but also of God's faithfulness. And then, on top of that, God says, you're going to name your son Isaac because you laughed, Abraham, so that you would remember your laughing, and that you would remember that I am the God that keeps promises, not breaks them. And so Abraham here is being given signs after signs and reminders for the rest of his life to never doubt God again, because God keeps his promises. God is faithful. And when he had finished talking with him, God went up from Abraham. Then Abraham took Ishmael his son and all those in his house or bought with his money, every male among the men of Abram's house, and he circumcised the flesh of their foreskins that very day. And God had said, as God had said to him. Abram was 99 years old when he was circumcised in the flesh of his foreskin. And Ishmael, his son, was 13 years old when he was circumcised in the flesh of his foreskin. That very day, Abraham and his son Ishmael were circumcised, and all the men of his house, those born in the house and those bought with money from a foreigner, were circumcised with him. Abraham follows God. Finally, he chooses to obey. The doubt is gone at this point. He might have a little bit of doubt with the laughing, but he's now on track and following God. And so this unbelief that Abram and Sarah had in the beginning is now turning into belief. They're finding hope, and God has come to them again 23 years later and has made this covenant. And now it is a physical manifestation in Abram's body that God will be with them. I'm back. So that is Genesis 16 and 17. It sets up the rest of the book for us, and it shows us that we must believe God, that we can't doubt him, that he will always bring his promises to fruition. And we're going to see Isaac in chapter 21. We're still not there yet. We still have 4 chapters left until we get there, or 3 chapters left until we get to 21. And because of that, Abram and Sarai have to continue to be faithful and continue to not doubt and continue to know that God will continue his promises. And so for us today, what promises do we need to believe and remember that God has for us? What promises are we forgetting of God? Are we forgetting that God is leading all history to the culmination of Jesus' second coming? Are we dismayed about COVID and about race riots and potentially a race war? Are we in fear of that, and that God has somehow lost control of our nation, of our history? If we're afraid of that, we have to remember that God is working all things together for the good of those who love him and called according to his purposes. If all the way back with Abraham and Sarah, God was making a way both for Jesus to come from them and for us to be grafted in as Gentiles, he's making a way today for us to see the kingdom of God. And so while the days are dark and evil at hand, while there's much unrest that's happening right now, we have nothing to fear because God is with us. God is with you. And so trust God. Trust him with all of your might. And remember that he keeps his promises. And it might be 23 years later. It might be 43 years later. Remember Moses, he was 80 years old when he was called to go back to Egypt to lead his people out. It might take a long time for God to move in our estimation, and yet he's always faithful. So friends, thank you for tuning in today. It's great to have you here for Genesis 16 and 17. Next week, Pastor Bob will be talking about Lot and Sodom and sin, as well as Abraham and his role in all of that. Thank you for joining us. I'm excited for this series. This is going to be so much fun. I think we have 11 weeks left together. So get used to doing this whole medium of Zoom and or recording, and it's not easy. It's not fun to have to do it this way. But that said, it is great to be able to even be with you virtually. So I love you. Bob loves you. If you need anything, please email us, rgoble or bdrew@scottsdalebible.com. But anyways, guys, I'll see you in 2 weeks. Love you all.